Are you ready to make the most of your oil and gas mineral rights? Welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. Get the knowledge and resources you need to manage your minerals and royalties. Here is your host, Matt Sands.
Hello and welcome to the Mineral Rights Podcast. I'm your host, Matt Sands, and I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Williams, and we're here to help you make the most of your minerals and royalties. And today's episode, we're going to dive into the concept of a non-participating royalty interest, what you should know if you own mineral rights that might be burdened by a non-participating royalty interest or NPRI. And then also if you own an NPRI, we're going to have some very important information that could have a significant impact on how much you get paid in royalties. And so whether you're a mineral owner or the other side of the coin where you own the NPRI carved out of the mineral estate, and specifically the concept of a fixed versus a floating NPRI. And so we're going to talk about what the differences are between those two different types of non-participating royalty interests and how it can have a big impact on how much you get paid at the end of the day. So before we do that, though, we'll dive into some background information, talk about what you need to know about the mineral estate in general, and then we'll give you some examples to work through, and then talk about where you can go for help with this topic, because this gets very complex, Justin. Like we've talked about before we hit record, this is something where your head can swim, and even a very experienced attorney, it can get very complicated for them as well when they read these instruments that can have confusing language in it and could go either way in the interpretation of what you own. So definitely an area where you want to get legal help.
Yeah, you said it, Matt. And like you said, this gets extremely complicated. And we've talked about NPRI several times past episodes, but this is really a deeper dive on NPRI and how it can be split up and how it's managed. So diving in the background. So non-participating royalty interest, to really grasp this concept, it's good to put it in context of other rights that are part of the mineral estate. There's 5 key rights that pertain specifically to mineral interests. The first, the right to drill a well. So if you own mineral interests, you have the right to drill a well in order to extract the oil and gas. The right to drill begins with the mineral interest owner. However, most of us convey this right to an oil and gas company by signing an oil and gas lease. Right, that allows them to go out and be able to drill that well. The privilege of signing an oil and gas lease is known as the executive right, which allows the owner of an undivided interest to sign a lease. If you have retained the executive right after granting mineral interest, you are the one who decides who gets to lease your minerals. The right to receive bonus payments is usually tied to that executive right. So you're able to execute the lease. You own that executive right. It means you can receive the bonus. When you sign a lease, the rent for that oil and gas lease is usually paid up front as a lease bonus payment rather than in a monthly or annual rental payments. And that's why most oil and gas leases are paid up oil and gas leases these days. That has not always been the case. This bonus payment is the rent that the company leasing your minerals is paying you for the right to drill a well for that specified term. Another right is the delay rental, which is a concept that is not as relevant today as it used to be. Delay rental payments were made to keep the lease in force during the primary term, which is the period when the leasee is required to drill a well, or they could pay a delay rental. However, most of the oil and gas leases today are paid up oil and gas leases that cover the full primary term of the lease. So delay rentals are not typically applicable in more modern oil and gas leases, though you do still see them in leases that are many years old. Another right is the right to receive the royalties, which is the right to receive payment for any production that you get. Speaking of royalties, when you own mineral rights and a successful well is drilled, you receive your proportional share of the royalties for any oil and gas that's produced and sold. Matt, we've talked about a lot how you can grant a portion of your royalty right to someone without granting any of the other rights. So, for example, you can retain that executive right, and you could grant the royalty right to somebody else. You would receive the bonus payment. They would receive the payment for production. And when you're doing that, you're granting what is called a non-participating royalty interest. It does not participate in the ability to receive bonus payments or delayed rentals or the executive rights, meaning that they don't have the election or the choice on who's going to drill. A non-participating royalty interest, or NPRI, allows the owner to receive a portion of the royalty interest payments from any oil and gas that's sold, but does not give them that right to sign the lease. And Matt, you and I were talking before we hit record that both of us have some minerals that are in this situation. And one of the pros is you don't really have to manage it as much. You're just receiving those royalty payments. You're not choosing who's leasing it. But the downside is you are subject to whoever has that executive right signing good terms in a lease, because if they don't, your royalty payment is impacted and there's not much you can do about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And especially if it is a floating NPRI, and we'll talk about what that means here in a second. And one distinction that Justin mentioned was the executive right. And there is a concept called a non-executive mineral interest, or NEMI. And so what we're talking about with an NPRI is not to be confused with that non-executive mineral interest. And we talk about a lot of these confusing terms. Don't worry, this is an area where, again, get help from a qualified attorney if you have questions, because this can get very complicated. It gets confusing for me, and I look at this stuff every day. And so, again, with that NPRI, the use case for that, if you think about it, back in the day, let's say we had a great grandfather that was a farmer or rancher. Times were tough. They needed to pay the bills. They might have sold a portion of their royalty interest through granting a non-participating royalty interest, or NPRI, to somebody to get an upfront payment to help them pay the bills to make it through that tough time. They retain the executive rights. They retain the majority of the mineral interest, but then they may have granted a 1/4 non-participating royalty interest just to help generate some cash. And so that can be one use case. Another use case for a non-participating royalty interest is if you want to grant a portion of the mineral estate to some grandkids who are minors, and maybe they're not equipped to negotiate an oil and gas lease, or if you have kids that maybe aren't as familiar with oil and gas and like you haven't done the homework like you have, but you want to give some of that to them, what you could do is grant a non-participating royalty interest where you retain control over the ability to sign that lease to get the best terms, but then your kids or grandkids can benefit from those royalty payments from any wells that are drilled. So it can be a very useful tool, but it can be very complex and confusing depending on the language that is used in the deed that conveys those interests. And again, it is something where you just got to be very careful in the way that you interpret those. And again, it just usually will result in needing to hire a qualified attorney to help you understand exactly what you own to make sure you're getting paid correctly, because it can have a significant impact on the royalty payments that you receive. One last thing on that non-executive mineral interest. This is something that I really don't like, and I'll tell you why. It's because you have this disconnect between the person who's signing the lease, and presumably they also have the right to receive that lease bonus payment like Justin mentioned. They're going to try to get the highest lease bonus payment, oftentimes at a lower royalty rate. So what they're incentivized to do is actually in direct conflict with the NPRI owner, if it's a floating NPRI, or if it's the person that owns the royalty interest as part of that bundle of sticks. Because again, usually the trade-off that you're presented with when you are given an offer to sign an oil and gas lease is this oftentimes a multiple different options. Maybe it's $500 per net mineral acre as a lease bonus for, let's say, a 3/16 royalty, or maybe $250 lease bonus if you agree to a 20% or 25% royalty. And so oftentimes what we try to do as somebody that owns all of those 5 bundle of sticks as far as the mineral estate is concerned is we try to go for the highest royalty rate possible, because that means over time the value that we'll extract from the production of any oil and gas is going to be maximized. It's oftentimes short-sighted to try to maximize that lease bonus payment up front in exchange for, let's say, a 1/8 royalty or something very low, because that means you're actually directly impacting the value of those minerals. And this is something I can't stress enough. If you were to be given the choice between 0 bonus payment and 25% royalty rate, and let's say $500 per net acre for a 12.5% royalty rate, almost always it's better to go for the 0 bonus payment and the highest royalty rate, because the royalty rate has a direct impact on the value of your minerals going forward. If you ever decide you want to sell in the future, they're going to look at, okay, what's your decimal interest in those wells that are producing or any future wells? And the royalty payment will be twice as much with a 25% royalty as compared to with a 12.5% royalty or 1/8 royalty. So it's something where it can have a huge impact. And again, if you have a non-executive mineral interest where you have everything but those executive rights, then usually the person that has executive rights is going to try to maximize the bonus payment. And that means you're going to probably get the lowest royalty rate. that aside, we're not going to talk anymore about any MIs. They're an annoying aspect to the mineral estate, in my opinion, but they do exist and they are out there. But what we're talking about today, the concept of the non-participating royalty interest, or NPRI, is there's one big distinction. People may be familiar with an overriding royalty, and this is very similar to that in that it's a non-cost-bearing royalty. In other words, we don't pay our proportional share of the expenses to operate the well or any of that. The overriding royalty, though, is tied to the oil and gas lease. And so the overrides can come and go depending on whether that oil and gas lease is in effect. And the good thing about an NPRI is it is generally granted in perpetuity. And so that means that it does not expire when the oil and gas lease expires like an override does. And so that's an important distinction. When you get a royalty check, whether it's an override or NPRI, if the decimal interest is the same, it may look like they're the same thing in terms of the amount you're receiving in royalties, but just know that, let's say you have a vertical well that has an NPRI tied to the lease. That vertical well gets plugged and abandoned. The lease expires. That overriding royalty that you used to own goes away. And so you don't benefit from maybe 5 years down the road, they release the minerals and they drill a bunch of horizontal wells, but you don't get any of those future revenues associated with those horizontal wells. Whereas if you had an NPRI, you would, because it would be tied to the minerals. It doesn't expire. It's just sitting there dormant and waiting for somebody to come in and drill a well. So that's a great benefit for an NPRI. You don't have to try to figure out, is it still in effect or not? Again, depending on the language, each instrument, each deed is very different and it depends on the language in there, but I'd just say in general, they exist in perpetuity. So, Justin, now when we talk about the concept of a fixed versus a floating NPRI, it's important to know whether that interest, that NPRI, should be interpreted as a fixed NPRI or a floating NPRI, because it can have a significant impact on the net revenue interest. In other words, the decimal interest that you have in any wells that are drilled. And the thing that we'll talk about are some general examples and some general differences to help you understand the concepts and why you need to know whether you own a fixed NPRI or a floating NPRI, or on the other side of things, if you own minerals that are burdened by an NPRI, that you know what type of NPRI it is to make sure that you're getting paid correctly in terms of the royalties you have in any wells that are drilled and now or in the future. I think it helps, Justin, to talk about an example. So let's do that. And then I'll say one thing before we dive into that example is that a fixed NPRI oftentimes is calculated based on the total mineral production, and it remains constant regardless of the lease terms. And so in other words, that decimal that you would have in a well is not dependent on the lease royalty rate. It's fixed. That's hence the name fixed NPRI. And these are oftentimes also referred to as a fractional royalty interest. Now, floating NPRI, on the other hand, if you think about it in terms of the fact that the lease royalty rate can change over time, and hence the resulting decimal in those wells will float or change over time depending on that lease royalty rate, that floating NPRI is calculated as a fraction of the royalty that is specified in the oil and gas lease. And so it can vary depending on the lease royalty rate. So you might have, if it's a floating NPRI, you'd have one decimal if the underlying lease royalty rate was 12.5% versus if it was 3/16 or whatever. So that floating NPRI just means that the decimal that you have in a well can change over time depending on what the royalty rate is in the oil and gas lease that's in effect at any given time. So now let's talk about a specific example and why this is so important. Let's say that you have a mineral interest that's burdened by a 1/5 NPRI. In other words, a 20% NPRI. In this example, let's say that we have signed an oil and gas lease that has a 25% royalty. And then for the sake of simplicity, let's also just assume that we own 100% of the minerals in the unit in question. So in the fixed NPRI scenario, the NPRI owner receives 20% because, again, the minerals are burdened by a 20% NPRI. So that's a 20% non-participating royalty interest. In that case, the burdened mineral owner receives 5%, again, because we've signed a 25% royalty. So 25% minus 20 leaves you with 5%. So in this case, a fixed NPRI means that the mineral owner actually receives the minority share of the royalties from that. On the other hand, if you had a floating NPRI where you're dependent on the lease royalty rate, you would only get 5% if you're the NPRI owner, and then the burdened mineral owner would receive 20%. So again, we have a 25% royalty. We've granted a 20% floating NPRI. So in this case, it's 20% times 25%, which results in 5%. So because that floating NPRI is dependent on the lease royalty rate, it's much smaller. And so in that case, it can have a huge difference. Again, we'll talk about which one you would want given which side of the table you were on. If you're in that first example, the fixed NPRI, you would want to own the NPRI because that's going to get the majority of the royalties. On the second one, if you had the NPRI, you would actually have the minority share of the royalties. And so it makes it very different in terms of the actual amount of royalties you're going to receive and then the value of that interest, again, just as a result. So again, as you can tell, the classification, whether an NPRI is classified as a fixed or a floating NPRI, can have a huge impact on the division of the royalty payments to the various interest owners. And it all boils down to the language in the deed. Justin, do you want to talk about some examples of fixed NPRIs and then also some examples of floating NPRIs? And we'll talk about why they may have gotten interpreted one way or the other over time.
Yep, absolutely, Matt. And yeah, the devil's in the details when it comes to deeds. So a couple words can really make an impact. And so what we're talking about here are different phrases you might see and what that is alluding to as far as whether that's a fixed or a floating scenario. Some examples of fixed NPRIs is wording like 1/4 royalty in all oil and gas and other minerals in and under hereinafter produced. Another example is an undivided 1/16 royalty interest of any oil and gas or minerals that may hereinafter be produced. And then last but not least, 1% royalty of all the oil and gas produced and saved. And Matt, this is not a comprehensive list, and it's certainly not legal advice. Please have an attorney look at your deed. Case law evolves, then for every time that there's a standard phrase, there is going to be a non-standard phrase. And some examples of floating NPRIs, under which the amount of production received by the royalty owner fluctuates according to the amount of the lessor's royalty provided for in the lease, 1/16 of all the oil royalty, 1/2 interest in all royalties received from any oil and gas leases, 1/2 or 1/8 of the oil and gas and mineral royalty that may be produced. So Matt, key takeaway is fixed NPRIs. You'll notice that these phrases say of all of the oil and gas and other minerals produced. They somehow refer to all of the oil and gas, Where with floating NPRIs, it's referring to all of the royalty. And so it's really making that definition of, I am giving you my right to receive royalties versus I am giving you the right to share in my right to receive royalties. And for the floating NPRIs, you're going to see that royalty phrase typically. And then for fixed, you're going to see that of any or all oil and gas and minerals. So a very easy one to miss, Matt, but a very important one.
Yeah, and that's a great rule of thumb. Like Justin mentioned, I will say the one tricky aspect to this is back in the day, the usual royalty rate was 1/8. And so oftentimes you'll see something referred to as the usual 1/8 royalty. And what a really interesting twist to all of this is that some courts have determined that's actually referring to the mineral estate because of the assumption at the time that the royalty would remain 1/8 over time. And so when they refer to that, they're really referring to the mineral interest. And that, I think the second or third example that Justin gave on the fixed NPRI, where it's 1/2 of the 1/8 royalty interest, that example could be interpreted as a fixed NPRI, even though it mentions royalty in there because of that 1/8 royalty. So it's a double fraction, but it really is not something where it should be interpreted as 1/16. It should be 1/2. And so that's a huge difference as well. So that's why this is so important to get an attorney to look at these things, because you could look at it and say, this thing says I have 1/2 of the 1/8 royalty interest. I guess that means I have a 1/16 fixed MPRI. It could be that it's actually a 1/2 fixed MPRI because it's referring to the 1/8 royalty, and that could be interpreted by the courts as actually meaning the full mineral estate. So this is so confusing. There's a lot of ambiguity. Certain language can be interpreted one way or the other, again, depending on how the courts have ruled. And it could vary by state. So that's something where maybe in Texas, they may have interpreted that saying of 1/8, the usual 1/8 or 1/8 royalty interest as a fixed MPRI, but maybe some other states have taken a different stance. And so again, you just really need to get with a qualified attorney. If you have an MPRI, and if it's a significant MPRI, especially, and it'd be a really good idea to sit down with an attorney, take a look at your deed, pull out your division order, show them what you're getting paid on existing wells, if there are any. Or if you are getting ready to sign a division order, maybe you have some horizontal wells that have just been drilled and you're about ready to get some significant royalty payments. That would be a great time to sit down and make sure everything is squared away and that you agree with that division of interest and your decimal interest in those new wells before you start receiving royalties, so that you don't have to chase after the operator for the underpayment of royalties, and you get it all squared away before you sign that division order. In Texas is really the only state that you're required to sign the division order in order to get paid royalties. And so it's even especially important in Texas to make sure that's correct before you sign it, just because it's going to determine how much you get paid on those wells. In other states, you will get paid royalties even if you don't return a division order generally. There's some nuance there, but you don't have to sign your life away per se. In other states, if you don't feel comfortable signing it, then you maybe don't sign it. But Texas is the other way around. It'll be, your interest will be held in suspense. In this case, if you have an MPRI and you feel like you're under the gun, you need to return that. Otherwise, your interest will be held in suspense. Maybe it's better that actually gets held in suspense while you wait and get this squared away with the help of an attorney first before you commit to something that is incorrect. So yeah, I think this is a topic that can get very technical, very confusing, but we did want to talk about it just to make you aware of the concept of, first of all, a non-participating royalty interest, which we've mentioned on the show several times, but we've never really did a full deep dive on this topic. And so we wanted to do that today, and then also talk about that difference between fixed versus floating, because it can make a huge difference in how much you get paid at the end of the day. So it's really important to know what you own so that you can make sure that you're making the most of your minerals and royalties. Right, Justin?
You said it, Matt. Yeah, and we were talking a little bit before we hit record. Attorneys aren't perfect either. And it's definitely worth asking the question, I own an NPRI. Can you tell me what type of NPRI this is? We've both, I'm sure, had scenarios where we've had an attorney look at a deed, look at an estate, and they say, okay, here's what I think. But then somebody else sees something else and you have to go back. The devil is in the details, and this one phrase can make such an impact. So certainly don't just send it to the attorney and say, hey, tell me about this. Ask the right questions. And for mineral owners, your job is to really know what questions to ask and then have an effective way to store this information. When this comes up again, you already know the answer. Otherwise, it can get lost in either your legacy or the properties being passed along, or even just forgotten by yourself. It's happened to me for sure.
Yeah, that's a great reminder to be sure to have copies of all of your deeds and leases and all of that. And why it's important, especially if there's a new operator that takes over, you see a difference in that decimal interest, and you had an idea that you had a fixed MPRI, and then they all of a sudden are treating it as a floating, and you have much smaller decimal, and then that could be a trigger to go and say, no, actually, this is what I own. This is why I should be getting paid this higher amount that the previous operator had interpreted one way, and that was, we believe, the correct way. But yeah, you just have to stay on top of it, and that's just why we talk about oil and gas, minerals and royalties as mailbox money, and so you can just get those royalty check and cash it and never take a look at it or dig into it, but then you can be leaving a lot of money on the table. So we always encourage you to have copies of those documents, know where to find them, have all of that in your will or trust, and make sure that your heirs know exactly what you own, and so that they don't have to go through the process of trying to figure it all out from scratch. Anyway, hopefully this was helpful, and stay tuned for more information on important topics like this. You can go to mineralrightspodcast.com, where we'll have some links to additional resources in the show notes, and we'll talk to you in the next episode. Thanks, Justin.
Thanks, Matt.
Thanks so much for listening to the Mineral Rights Podcast with your host, Matt Sands. Don't forget to subscribe and share at mineralrightspodcast.com. The Mineral Rights Podcast should not be construed as investment, legal, or tax advice. All information is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representation as to its completeness or accuracy.